Give me one sec.
Hi, Jen. Nice to see you. Thanks for being here to talk about our communities.
All right, hi everyone. We're going to be starting shortly, just working out the streaming. Almost there. All right, I'm just gonna hope that it's working. And if it doesn't, that's okay. We're gonna be recording. Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining. Just to let the press know, we're gonna have 4 speakers and then you'll have an opportunity to ask questions at the end. There's also legislators available if you have questions about the process and the trajectory of any legislation. If people could please mute themselves and just unmute yourself when it's your turn to speak. And at the end, if you want to ask a question, the easiest way to do that for me would be if you can type into the chat the outlet that you're with and just type your name in case it doesn't show up properly on your Zoom. You can type that in at any point and I'll review that and then I'll just call on people to ask questions. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this over to Alex Yin. Dr. Alex Yin is Winooski School Board District Board Member.
Thank you, Maggie, and thank you for people coming to this press conference on an issue that I think is imperative to the future of Vermont. But before I start, I want to acknowledge the students in Winooski who are teaching school board members like me how to be an anti-racist school district. And one of the lessons I've learned from them is that it's important that we stand up and speak against inequalities in our systems. And thus, I'm speaking to you about the importance about taking up the weighting study recommendations during the legislative session. So I really want to emphasize, I speak to you not as a Winooskiite, but as a fellow Vermonter asking our state legislators to come together and support the weighting study bill. As a Vermonter, we are defined by our passion for equity and strong democracy, a democracy that can only be nourished and strengthened by an educated populace. Yet this democracy that we cherish is threatened by the inequities of our educational funding formula. No doubt we had an inkling about these issues. It was only a few years ago that fellow legislators commissioned a study that was completed by a research team led by esteemed University of Vermont professor Tammy Colby. In her study, she uses data to highlight and show that what we probably already knew. Due to circumstances, it does cost more to educate certain types of students. I recognize that sometimes it's difficult to kind of grasp from only looking at this from a numbers perspective. So let's talk about real life examples that bring these numbers to life. And these are examples that I'm gonna say were even exuberated by the current pandemic. In Winooski, I know our superintendent is constantly balancing the pros and cons of having an in-person model. Oftentimes, it is a lose-lose situation. Generational poverty means that our school district not only needs to consider how to educate our students, but also be concerned about how we feed them. This includes providing healthcare too. Why do we do this? Because we know a healthy student who is fed and who gets their nutritional needs is going to be a better learner. And these are some of the additional constraints that a school district like Winooski has. But we also have a lot of new Americans that we also need to invest. And I say invest extra resources into our education so that we can build, and I want to emphasize this, a stronger community. A community where the child's education is going to be supported by their family. This is why we have cultural liaisons to keep parents involved with their children's education. This is not meant to be a complaint, but an illustration of reality. I cannot emphasize enough, we want these families here because they do enrich our community. And so these are not costs that we feel burdened by, but an investment that we think is important and imperative to the future of Vermont. A funding formula that is inequitable causes school districts to be reactive to problems instead of being proactive and strategic. I am proud of what our school district has done with the constraints the funding formula has placed on us. The current educational formula says that we have about 1,000 equalized pupils, but with the updated study, it says that we actually have 1,600 equalized pupils. Imagine what more we could do if we did not have such constraints. I know this is going to be hard work to implement, especially as we continue to deal with the pandemic. But I also know this is true of us. As Vermonters, we never run away from the hard. Instead, we steer into it and we roll up our sleeves and we fix what needs to be fixed. And let's be honest, we can put a Band-Aid solution to the pandemic, or we can work on something that should have never been affected by this pandemic. There are rare times when there's a bill that can unite us all. The reason I support this bill is because it does unite us all. This is why I'm sitting across esteemed colleagues like O.J. Kalmar, a junior in the Winooski School District, Allison Knott, president of the Rutland City Public School Board of Commissioners, and Dr. Jennifer Botsoljen Jorn, the Kingdom East superintendent of our schools. And they will speak more about these issues as we continue with the press conference. Not to take up this bill will be a moral failure on us all. It will signal to our children that we do not care. And if that's the case, then the values that I thought embody what it means to be a Vermonter were false. So let's be leaders and work to make a better and more equitable Vermont, where our children's futures is not dictated by where they live in that state. Thank you, and I'm gonna hand it over to Kalmar Daring, who's gonna explain how some of these funding issues impact his education in Winooski. Kalmar?
All right, thank you, Alex. So as a student, it's very hard to determine what you need and what's not being given to you. The challenge further increases when the idea of equity comes into play. However, something I as a student have noticed is a complete lack of funds towards transportation in our district. So I believe this is an issue that stems directly from the problem of budgeting and how it's handled within the education system. As it stands right now, small schools such as mine completely lack the resources to provide for the students, as they are torn between their priorities and what they should offer the students. This leads to problems such as the one we have right now with transportation. So on top of completing their duties as students, kids have to worry about how they're also going to get home that same day. Now I want you to picture an elementary schooler, someone who hasn't even hit double digits yet, walking home in the freezing cold, all because it's winter and our school has to choose what to prioritize when they're looking at their funds / their budget. And I can say from personal experience, because my dad was working early in the morning, because my dad wasn't able to drive me to school, because there was no dedicating busing for our students, that getting to school was not a fun part of the schooling experience. On top of that, this isn't even the tip of the icing, as I was lucky enough to be able to rely on the city bus as I lived close to a bus stop. But for those who weren't as fortunate, getting to school sometimes meant walking there in the Vermont winter. And for those of you who have lived in Vermont, you should know how unforgiving the weather is sometimes. Now, my point here isn't that we as a school should reroute some of our current budget to transportation. In fact, that's already been done. However, the success of doing so, I believe, is still questionable. What I am instead saying, though, is that we as a school have too tight of a budget to grant students with the resources they all need in order to be successfully academically.
Sorry, thank you, Kalmar. Can I pass it on to Allison Knott to talk about who I remind you is the president of the Rutland City Public School Board of Commissioners, to talk about the experience of Rutland and the impact it has on the Rutland Public Schools.
Thank you, Alex. So yes, I'm Allison Knott, president of the Rutland City Board of School Commissioners. Thank you all for joining the conversation regarding providing equitable, accessible opportunities to education for all Vermont students. The legislature commissioned the UVM report that found serious inequities in the current pupil weighting system. This data supports what our school district has seen and has been facing in meeting increased student needs over the past several years. The current weighting is over 20 years old and lacks consideration of the actual cost of educating students with diverse needs. Rutland City Public Schools, also known as RCPS, serves a large population of economically challenged students, close to 95% of our K through 8 students. Statistically, at an early age, children living in poverty come into school with existing disadvantages. Extra supports and resources are needed to catch up. This readiness gap continues to grow and disparities continue throughout all grade levels. When returning to Vermont in 2010, one of my children was in 2nd grade, and she came home from her first day of school in 2nd grade and was amazed that some of her classmates could not write their names, never mind read. We had moved from a small bedroom community outside a metropolitan area, and most people in the area have similar economic background in the bedroom community, and she had never seen the differentiation of needs amongst her classmates. And while she came from a classroom of 22 students to a classroom of 12, I still believe her teacher in Vermont had much more challenges in facing the diverse needs of the students. Additionally, 50 to 75% of RCPS incoming kindergartners have experienced trauma. Trauma situations at home interfere with students' ability to access education. Even if physically present in the classroom, the ability to learn is hampered. RCPS has invested in trauma-informed practices. Poverty and associated trauma can continue to affect students' learning as students move through all grade levels. In order to meet the increased needs and make educational opportunities accessible to all, RCPS invests many resources to provide supports. Small classroom size is one of the ways to help meet these needs. Additional supports also include school counselors, nurses, mental health workers, access to food, access to technology, and differentiated learning opportunities. So Rutland City Public Schools offers alternative programming to provide additional supports to meet student needs. We have Peerpoint Learning Center, which is for essential early education. Bridges is a new program introduced in our middle school to provide more student support and reduce educational disruptions. Allen Street campus is a middle school through high school alternative path where each classroom is staffed with a special educator and a paraeducator to help students develop needed emotional regulation skills to succeed in school and the community. And our Grove Street campus is a full academic program for high school students who have experienced frustration or failure in traditional programming on the main campus. Many of these students are working many hours outside of school to support themselves or their families, and the traditional structure just doesn't fit. And this is an opportunity to keep them in school, get them to graduation, and provide them opportunities where they may have dropped out due to their family needs. These programs of support many of the differentiated student needs, but they cost more per pupil to run. Under the current weighting formula, RCPS is being underfunded for providing these needed supports, and in turn cannot grow to increase the needs. Yet meeting these needs are essential to our students and educating our children. The disparities in education have also come into the forefront with COVID-related disruptions and changes. Despite deploying technology, access, and meals to our most needy students, educators have already seen educational losses from last spring. These changes in education and delivery and supports during the pandemic will create challenges over the next few years and will require more supports for these students to overcome yet another setback. The current weighting formula incentivizes increased spending for children in large wealthy districts with the least needs and decreased spending for students in poor or rural districts with the most needs. The solution can be found in the recommendations in the study presented to the legislature in December of 2019. The report revealed decades-old inequities and offered an empirically derived solution. The new formula will allow districts to provide more resources to students that need them the most. There are bills such as H54 in legislature now, and I would urge the legislature to take up and implement the new weights this year. Vermont must adopt new weights to meet our constitutional obligation to provide equal educational opportunities to all students. If we choose to wait or not implement these new weights, we are knowingly perpetuating inequity and harm in Vermont's educational system. Our schools and our children deserve equitable access to education, to educational opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison, for highlighting some of the difficulties and highlighting really the educational realities in your district. I'm now going to pass it on to Dr. Jen Botzel-John to talk about the issues in the Kingdom East School District.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? Thank you for being here. I am serving in my 5th year as superintendent in a rural remote Kingdom East School District in the Northeast Kingdom, and my prior 15 years of work were at Mount Mansfield School District in Chittenden County. I'm here today to encourage your work passing legislation this session that addresses the disproportional needs our rural schools face. Adopt the recommendations of the weighting study. Examples of the struggles of our rural and high poverty communities include, but are not limited to, 1, attrition. In 2019, 5 of our rural schools had approximately 20% attrition rates. 20% of our teachers left at the end of the year. Teachers left, they come to our district, they obtain experience, and then they leave because a spouse cannot find work in our area, they want access to more amenities, or they seek higher paying positions. That has a significant impact on our ability to have deep, consistent academic teaching. It compromises relationships in our schools. If we choose to wait or not implement the new weights from the weighting study, our children will continue to see turnover in their schools because we can't address the needs without the resources. 2, academics. This year, our professional staff have 32 emergency or provisional licenses. 7 of these provisional licenses are in middle school math or science. What this means is that folks don't have the college degrees in these areas. In some schools, 1 teacher teaches 5th, 6th, and 7th grade math and science. So the teachers are doing 6 preparations in 2 content areas. They're exhausted. We can't pay for the smaller class sizes to support the grade level learning. So I know that in more affluent communities, there are AP Art or AP French classes with 8 or 9 students. We can't afford that, and we can't afford such small classes, and this leads to an academic opportunity or achievement gap. Implementing the weighting study will allow us to provide more resources to support our children who need and want to become mathematicians and scientists. 3, facilities. Over time and tight budgets, has resulted in neglected facilities. In 3 of our schools, we had no ventilation. We have a pandemic, no ventilation. We have sewage ejector pumps in classrooms, so the gray water doesn't back up. We have 2 schools that have 20-plus-year-old mobile temporary classrooms that house some of our students. The existing weights are arbitrary and don't consider the actual cost for educating children with disparate needs or operating schools in different contexts. The current system, it's inequitable, and we can't wait. Whether it's teacher attrition, facilities, teacher quality preparation, being rural means there are simply not as many resources. The Vermont Constitution states that every child must be afforded substantially equal access to a quality public education, and this is not the case. At this point in history, when our nation is grappling with inequities, it's our duty to take action on this weighting study this year. Our children can't wait. They deserve the same opportunities available to all children in Vermont. So I thank you for letting me share my perspective.
Thank you, Jen. And I'm going to open up to questions, but I'm going to just really emphasize that this is not a certain area of Vermont kind of project. We're all speaking here as Vermonters who want us to take care of the children of our state. Maggie, open up questions.
Thank you so much, everybody. So if anybody has a question, please just type in your outlet and your name. Well, it looks like most of your names are coming up properly. So the first question we have is Devin Bates with Local 22 and Local 44. Go ahead, Devin.
Oh, I got to turn my mic or camera on there. My question is for some of the lawmakers in the call. I'm interested to hear a little bit more about age 54. I know a lot of this is based on the Agency of Education Pupil Weighting Factors Report that found the system is outdated. If you could just kind of talk a little bit more about what that report dug up and how your work was informed by that, and if you could go into a little bit of detail on the ways in which it's outdated and how this bill seeks to address that.
That sounds like a good question for Representative Sibilia.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the question. So the weighting study report that you're referencing came as a result of the legislature itself having a debate over a number of years about whether or not we were providing equitable resources for different types of students throughout Vermont. As you've heard today, we have students with varying needs across our state. A number of us on this call had pushed for examining whether or not rural students, necessary rural districts were being provided enough resources. We knew that there were also other types of students who were likely being denied adequate resources. It was Dave Sharp, actually, the chair of House Education several years ago. His committee ended up pushing out this request based on what they believed was likely inadequate funding for students in poverty. And so we pushed this report out, this request for this report out, and we wanted to see how states across the country were determining how to fund the education, equitable opportunities for different types of students. And so it took several years to get that passed. At one point, we were threatening to sue to get it passed, but in fact, it was passed and delivered to the legislature last Christmas Eve. So again, the legislature asked, we're not sure that we are providing equitable resources for all Vermont students. Please go out, look at how we're determining how to distribute resources or make resources available, and tell us, look around the country, look at places that have specialists in rurality, population density, and poverty, and tell us. So they looked at the existing weights, which we had several, and then looked at the factors that we had asked, and came back and basically told us that the existing weights, which are how we account for different types of students, were basically political agreements that had been made in the implementation of Act 60. There really was not any empirical evidence pointing to why we had those weights in place. And they made recommendations about how we should adjust the weights in order to meet our constitutional duty. And the current financing mechanism was brought about as part of a lawsuit alleging that we were failing our constitutional duty, which was won, the Brigham case. Looking at how we're doing this, made a recommendation on how we have to shift allocation and access to resources in order to meet our constitutional duty. So we asked, and now we've been told. And so that doesn't leave us a lot of room in my book. What we've seen, my colleagues and I, is with the pandemic, we received this report last year, 2.5 months before the pandemic broke. And my colleagues, and I think everyone on the phone on this call, would say to you that as a result of the pandemic, we have seen that where there were inequities in place before the pandemic, they have gotten worse. They have gotten worse, which we know that, most Vermonters are suffering in one way or another through this pandemic, but these are our kids, and these are our most needy kids, and it's gotten worse for them. This bill would seek to put in place the existing weights, but first it would start with, let's do no harm. So we have a mechanism in Vermont legislature, in Vermont statute, which helps to keep spending down for all Vermonters, which is certainly something that we all need to be cognizant of. It's called the excess spending penalty. It works no matter where you are. If you have inequities, it's working against you, as well as districts that are wealthy and large. So this bill first seeks to suspend that penalty for this year, the year that we're in right now, for the budgets that are being voted on this year. It then looks to put in place next year and next year's budgets.
baby.
I'm sorry.
Just listening.
Next year to put in place all of the weights with the exception of the poverty weight. The poverty weight that came back is significant. The findings in the report are that we have been dramatically underfunding our poorest students. And so correcting that is going to be significant and noticeable. And so we would put in place all of the new weights next year and 1/3 of the poverty weight. And we would continue over the next 2 years to roll in the second and third thirds. In addition, because those weights, correcting those weights will be noticeable, there are districts who are currently overweighted. These would be our least needy students and districts. And they will see changes in their property tax. So over the next 3 years, we would see a mitigation of that, helping those districts absorb some of the shock of that. And it also would preserve our merger grants. It would preserve our merger grants and also provide some oversight and accountability in terms of whether or not we're seeing what we want to see from these weights. And this is something actually that Representative Sims from the Kingdom had worked on to make sure we included in the bill. These are reporting from an oversight committee made up of our appropriations committees, our finance committees, and our education committees in both the House and Senate, requiring them to meet twice a year to hear from school boards, superintendents, principals, teachers, community members about what the effects are that they're seeing in their district as a result of these changes in the weights. This is something that Representative Ansell, chair of the Ways and Means Committee, has expressed a lot of concern about whether or not we, in shifting these weights, will be able to make sure that the resources make their way to the students. In addition, this bill would require our districts to report on their education quality standards reporting forms, what kind of decisions they're making as a result of the changed weights. So those are the major factors that are in this H54.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Representative Sibilia. I got a message from John Walters from the Vermont Political Observer.
Good morning. I guess my first question, maybe this is in the study, is do you have an idea of how much money would have to be shifted around? And, how much a district that's well off under the current system might lose out?
Did you want me to take this, Maggie?
Yeah, I think that's probably a question, Representative Sibilia, that you should take.
Sure. So, John, the JFO has done some modeling on this, in addition to the modeling that you can find in the weighting study report, that looks at if district spending were the same. The study has numbers from 2018. If the district spending remained unchanged, what would likely happen with their tax rate? JFO, looking at our bill H54, they did some very high level calculations based on potential cost, and these calculations would they are modeled having the poverty weight roll in 1 year as opposed to 3 years, as I've outlined we would do. So the numbers that I'm going to give you are worse than what would actually happen as a result of this bill. The bill seeks to mitigate any tax increase over 20% that an overweighted district would feel. And so that would come out of the education fund. If we were to mitigate all tax effects as opposed to the 20%, and we rolled in all of the weights and the poverty weight in 1 year, that would be a shift within the system of $50 million.
550.
50.
All right.
Okay, so that is not what our bill says. Okay, if we were to roll in the entire poverty weight in 1 year and mitigate up to 10% of the tax increase, that would be $15 to $20 million. And again, that is not what the bill says. If we were to roll it in 1 year, the poverty weight in 1 year, and mitigate 20%. The 20% is what the bill says, but it also rolls in poverty over 3 years. But if we did it in one, it would be 5 million. So this is this is something that certainly we can get our arms around, particularly in a year like this year. I think it's really important. I think my colleagues and co-sponsors would agree that it's really important that we try to reduce shocks in the system, but also we know we have to move, we have to act, so.
Compared to the total amount of school spending, those numbers are maybe lower than I would have thought they would be. I mean, any dollar is a political battle, but that seems like it's, you know, not as catastrophic as I thought.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you so much to everyone for being here. And please email me if you want to follow up with any of our awesome speakers today. Thanks, everybody.